Hello, class. This video is going to look into the evolution of reproduction and also how that relates to non-random mating. These ideas kind of draw heavily upon a branch of biology that we call evolutionary ecology, but hopefully we'll see that there's pretty important implications surrounding how these different processes play out in the context of evolution. And so a sort of fundamental question to ask here is, why reproduction? Why does reproduction happen? Well, you might recall that life persists only as genes are being inherited by offspring, and this is going to happen either via sexual reproduction or via asexual reproduction. And one of the reasons why this happens is because mortality is essentially inevitable. And so why wouldn't organisms be selected to pass on genes to the next generation so that their lineages can persist? And we know that new mutations occasionally in offspring can make future generations more fit, thus perpetuating genetic diversity as reproduction is happening, whether it's happening sexually or happening asexually. Just to review briefly, via sexual reproduction, we know that fertilization is required. That is, that we have separate males and females who produce sperm and egg, respectively, and those sperm and egg join together during this process of fertilization and form a zygote. And this process sort of repeats itself over and over again. This is the basic sexually reproducing life cycle. In contrast, asexually reproducing populations don't require any fertilization at all. This could happen in a couple ways. The most common way we might think of asexual reproduction happening is via this process of binary fission, by which through cell division, offspring are formed. And in this particular instance, we're talking about single-celled organisms, whereas when we're talking about sexually reproducing organisms, we're almost always going to be talking about multicellular organisms. And so these are two general categories of reproductive strategies that different life forms use. And we're going to take a look into how it is that natural selection could favor one or the other in different circumstances. So an important thing to recognize is that all living things really have to deal with this balance between the cost of reproduction and the cost of survival. And this necessarily imposes energy budgets upon organisms, which constrain the allocation of resources. So organisms are able to take resources from the environment. We could call that C, which stands for consumption. And then they have to partition how that energy is essentially going to be spent into these components, P, R, U, and F, which respectively, P stands for production of tissue, repair of tissue, perhaps, if tissue is damaged. R stands for reproduction, so making offspring. U stands for urea, which basically refers to uric acid, which basically simply refers to the breakdown of protein products, which takes energy. And F refers to fecal matter, which basically is the proportion of energy organisms consume, which cannot be used to do work. And so by the laws of thermodynamics, energy is conserved, and organisms are only able to take in a finite amount of it, generally speaking, and they have to break it up into these constituent components. And this causes this interesting balance between the cost of really two important things here, production, which is sort of like survival, and reproduction, which is, again, like making offspring. In the hypothetical framework here, we can look at the correlation between survival and reproduction and how that really depends upon differences in resource acquisition compared to differences in resource allocation. And so in this framework, we have two different genetic loci, A and B, and locus A is basically pretty much positively correlated with survival and reproduction. So as there's more resource allocation, both survival and reproduction potentially can increase. And we see some variation in how that happens amongst examples used here. But then there's this other locus B, which is the resource allocation locus. And this resource allocation locus breaks up the way that the resources are going to be partitioned into things such as maintenance, survival, and growth, which is sort of like P or production in our little equation here, and things like reproduction, which is R in our little equation here. And basically, we can sort of quantify the amount of energy, amount of resource going into maintenance and survival and growth as X. And there's a certain amount of resources that are going into X. But as more and more resources related to survival, as shown here with this sort of red line, there are as more and more resources are going into reproduction, I should say, then fewer resources are being allocated to survival, and that leads to this situation where we have 1 minus X. And so, little by little, reproduction is really taking energy away from survival. And so, organisms really have to deal with this delicate balance between, well, how much energy is required for survival and how much energy is required to pass on genes to the next generation. And we might postulate that, well, passing on genes to the next generation is, of course, the most important thing in terms of fitness. But if organisms don't survive long enough to do that, then they also are compromising their fitness. So we basically kind of look at this situation that where if there is more acquisition, there are increased chances of survival and reproduction. So the positive correlation. But as more and more energy is being allocated to reproduction, the chances of survival are decreasing. And so again, we have this sort of delicate interaction between reproduction and survival that most organisms have. We can start then asking questions about, well, why are there males and females? And of course, when we talk about males and females, we are talking about populations that are reproducing sexually. They produce these things called gametes, sperm and egg, that undergo fertilization to form zygotes. How has natural selection come to favor this situation over very, very, very long periods of evolutionary time? Well, one explanation is that this affords populations two different ways to gain fitness. And so we can have gametes that are equally sized. We'll call them plus and minus, representing two separate genders. Call them male and female if you wish. Those are almost arbitrary terms in this case, but this is something called isogamy. And isogamy is thought to be probably the ancestral form of gametes in sexually reproducing organisms. Over time, and over time, anisogamy was instead favored, where now the gametes are being selected to exist in two very different sizes and in two very different abundances. It turns out that there are small gametes and large gametes, and the small gametes we tend to call male gametes, like sperm, and the large gametes we tend to call female gametes, which are eggs. And in the case of anisogamy, these gametes may or may not be able to move around. And as it turns out, probably what happened long ago, again in evolutionary history, is that large gametes were selected to be non-motile and small gametes were selected to be highly motile. And that leads to the sort of present situation that almost all sexually reproducing organisms have, which is something known as oogamy. And in oogamy, again, we have lots and lots of small motile male gametes being produced, sperm, that don't take a lot of energy to reproduce. Therefore, males can produce tons and tons of them. In contrast, we have large, immobile female gametes, eggs, and females tend to not really produce a whole lot of eggs. And these eggs require a lot of energy, especially if they're fertilized. The investment in provisioning these eggs into zygotes is pretty huge. And so males and females are kind of put into the situation where their gametes perform two very, very separate roles in the environment. But this affords, again, populations two different ways to gain fitness. You can have males that produce tons and tons and tons of sperm with high chances of eventually fertilizing a very small number of eggs that actually exist in a population. And so this allows this thing called sexual reproduction to happen. And sexual reproduction almost always mixes up genotypes over the course of generations, which generally leads to increases in genetic variation within populations, which, as we seem to know from Some other examples we've seen in terms of fitness, relative fitness and natural selection, increasing genetic variation tends to be a good. We can also talk about organisms that possess both female and male reproductive organs. And these organisms we would call hermaphrodites. And hermaphroditic organisms benefit from reproductive assurance because basically they can produce as males in some contexts, they could reproduce as females in other contexts. And so hermaphrodites kind of have two different ways to gain fitness within an individual. This tends to be most common in plants who really can only disperse their gametes via external vectors because plants generally don't move. And so they can either um, disperse male gametes through pollen if they are pollen producing plants or spores in non pollen producing plants, or they can sort of disperse their eggs in the form of zygotes within seeds and fruits that either are being transferred into the environment by wind or by animal vectors, whatever it may be. But this certainly happens in many, many species of flowering plants. The image on the left here is a nice microscopic image of a very, very small flower that contains both male producing gametes that we call stamen and female producing gametes that we call pistils. And this really can increase the chance of these individuals being able to mate either as females or males. Now, occasionally, hermaphrodites can self-fertilize, and that's sort of possible as a last resort if they're not able to outcross or reproduce with other plants. And that leads sometimes to this thing we call bet hedging. But as we know from our understanding of inbreeding depression, plants that self-fertilize tend to suffer from fitness consequences because probably a lot of really similar alleles are going to be pairing up during this process of self-fertilization. And so we think of that as something kind of leading to a decrease in the fitness of their offspring. But if they still are able to make offspring via this method or via this process, they're still gaining some fitness nonetheless. So just to reiterate, in these hermaphrodites, they possess these male functioning organs that produce male gametes. In flowers, we call them stamen, and they produce these female functioning organs that produce female gametes. In plants, we'd call these pistil. So that's kind of something we know about sexual reproducing organisms. What about asexual reproduction? Well, it's very, very commonplace in prokaryotic organisms, that is, things like bacteria and archaea, and it's pretty rare in most plants and animals, and it can be caused by multiple mechanisms. For example, in prokaryotes, most often, again, binary fission is the method by which reproduction happens, and this is as simple as a single cell dividing into two daughter cells, such as happens in the bacterium E. coli. This also can happen in some multicellular organisms as well, who can literally split their bodies in half, like these flatworms here. We also have things like budding. So tissue within an organism's body can start to divide and develop into another individual and eventually break off and become its own free living organism. And we see that in things like Hydra. There's also something kind of similar, which is fragmentation, which we can see in sea stars, where a piece of an organism's body can break off and grow into a whole new free living organism. And that's sort of what we see here with the sea star example in Linkia, where little by little it's going to form a piece that broke off of a parent plant is slowly developing into a daughter plant that will become its own free living organism. And in eukaryotic organisms, this could lead to offspring that are either haploid, that is, they're carrying one set of chromosomes, or offspring that are diploid, that carry two sets of chromosomes, which leads to them being either half clones or full clones. And this really depends upon the kinds of cells that are responsible for this asexual reproduction happening, whether these cells are meiotic, that is, cells that form gametes that are typically going to be haploid, or whether these cells are mitotic, which are cells that are not going to form let me say these cells are mitotic, they're going to be diploid, I guess is what I meant to say. So these are some ways that sexual reproduction can happen. In plants, asexual reproduction tends to be fairly unique. We see in a lot of species this thing called self-propagation, or also known as vegetative reproduction. A classic example of this might be spider plants. If you maybe some of you have these plants in your yard, but these plants will start to send out these runners that in turn are basically their offspring. And these runners over time can break off from the parent plant and go on to form new free living organisms. This is not terribly different than what we might see with things, something like fragmentation or budding. And these offspring will tend to be very, very genetically similar to their parents. Sometimes plants that reproduce in this way form these genetically identical colonies that we call genets, which are composed of individual plants we would call ramets. And a classic example of this is seen actually in a species that occurs here in the California desert, the creosote bush. And creosote shrubs will reproduce in this way, and they'll form these massive clones of individual shrubs that are actually were at one time all connected via these underground runners and all really share a common parent in common, and they're all pretty much genetically identical to each other. And these clones can live for really, really long periods of time. Lineages of these clones can go on and on and on and on for thousands of years. One of the oldest genets known from the California desert is something like more than 10,000 years old. And this is possible in plants because many of their tissues undergo this thing we call indeterminate growth. A lot of plant tissues don't necessarily have a predetermined fate, and so it's possible that plants can reproduce this way. Now, this leads us back to this concept of bet hedging. And many organisms will bet hedge with both sexual and asexual reproduction. So there are species who are capable of using both strategies. And when we talk about bet hedging, we're basically saying rather than investing all of the resources into one mode of reproduction, these organisms are kind of breaking up their chances of reproducing either sexually or asexually under different environmental circumstances, simply to increase the odds that one way or the other, they're going to be able to produce offspring. We can see this pretty commonly in aphids, and these aphids undergo a pretty interesting form of asexual reproduction that we call parthenogenesis, which is basically to say that they can reproduce uh, offspring from unfertilized eggs, which is kind of a strange and unique phenomenon. And they tend to do this early in the season when resources are fairly limited, because sexual reproduction takes a lot more energy than asexual reproduction. However, later in the year, when there's a lot more resources available and a lot more energy available for reproduction, these aphids will switch to reproducing sexually. And by using these two strategies, they sort of ensure their chances of being able to pass on genes to the next generation. And by being able to reproduce sexually in addition to asexually, these aphids are able to gain some genetic diversity every season when there's sufficient energy available. Something very similar is happening in strawberries, where at certain times of year when resources are maybe limited, these strawberries will reproduce vegetatively, sort of as we saw in the example with the spider plant. And that allows them to go on and produce new individuals. And then if there's a point in time when energy becomes sufficient, resources become sufficient in the environment, these strawberries will turn around and produce flowers, which enable them to now reproduce sexually. So these plants, again, are hedging their bets with two different reproductive strategies. We can also see that in violets, and these violets actually do something really bizarre. They can reproduce sexually, but they can also undergo a very bizarre form of self-fertilization, where their flowers never get fertilized and never really fully form. So this is just another example of sort of these plants using different strategies. But basically, again, this is something that seems to happen when reproduction is constrained by resource availability, or maybe even if reproduction is constrained by the abundance of mates, or perhaps in the case of plants, the presence of pollinators could limit sexual reproduction, prompting plants to instead reproduce asexually. So, whatever strategy they use, at the end of the day, at the end of the season, they have gone on to pass their genes on to the next generation, and that either way has allowed them to gain some fitness. When we talk about asexual reproduction, we're basically talking about females who are producing more daughters, and this tends to be appears to be very, very efficient, but it also leads to the question, well, why males? And as it turns out, populations producing males is kind of costly. It's almost kind of inefficient. And if we consider a population that can produce sexually and also can reproduce asexually, we can start to look at differences in how the females in the population are gaining fitness over the course of generations. And so let's just imagine that we had such a population, and the first generation of this population has an equal number of females and one male, and that there's a pair of female and a male that can reproduce sexually, and this other female is reproducing asexually. And let's assume that these sexually reproducing events produce 50-50% ratios of females to males in the second generation. And of course, the asexually reproducing female, she can produce 4 offspring, but they're all going to be female. And at this point in time, we see something interesting unfolding. First of all, the female in this sexually reproducing instance is only passing on 50% of her genetic information to the second generation because she's reproducing sexually. Whereas the asexually reproducing female is passing on 100% of her genetic information into the next generation because she doesn't have a mate. And if we start off with 33.3% of this population producing asexually, by the second generation, according to this situation we've set up, 50% of the population now will be reproducing asexually. If we look at how this plays out in the third generation under similar circumstances, we see that we've gone from having 1 female to 2 females to having 4 females here in the third generation via sexual reproduction. But instead, via asexual reproduction, we've gone from having 1 female to 4 females to having 16 females in the third generation. And as a result, now 66.7% of this population is reproducing asexually. And we can look at how this plays out in the fourth generation and the fifth generation. And what we can see is that the asexually reproducing females will come to dominate this population in as little as just 5 generations. Nearly 90% of the population now is reproducing asexually. And this points towards asexual reproduction being much more efficient and allowing this original female to have a significantly higher chance of passing on her genes to the next generation compared to if she tries to do so with a male via sexual reproduction over the course of each generation. And so basically, one of the important take-home messages of this thing we call the so-called the sort of twofold cost of producing males is that the production of males in a sexual population is really reproducing its reproductive potential. And asexual females are producing way more offspring and thus, by definition, have much higher fitness. And so this is an interesting situation that we see. This is something that's happening with whiptail lizards, by the way. These whiptail lizards have populations that are entirely composed of females, presumably because of this reason. And by the way, these whiptail lizards are also producing offspring from unfertilized eggs. And so the kind of quandary that lies here is that, well, if it's so disadvantageous to the females in populations to be reproducing sexually, if they could just as easily be doing it asexually and gaining a lot of fitness in the process, why is sexual reproduction so prevalent amongst eukaryotes? Well, one of the best answers to that question is that sexual reproduction leads to increased genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction produces genetically non-identical offspring, but asexual reproduction produces clones. And so this cartoon on the left kind of shows what asexual reproduction looks like. We have a parent. This parent replicates its DNA before splitting, divides either via binary fission, budding, fragmentation, whatever the case is. It produces two daughter offspring. These could be daughter cells or daughter tissues. But these offspring are genetically identical to the parents. This is very much different than what we see on the right with sexual reproduction, where two parents come together, let's say a father and a mother, and this father's sperm is able to fertilize this mother's egg and form a zygote that is not genetically identical to either of the parents. Typically, we would think of this zygote, which later develops into an embryo, as being about 50% related to either of its parents. It's carrying about 50% of the genes from the mother and about 50% of the genes from the father. And every time this process of sexual reproduction is happening, sperm and egg coming together during fertilization, gene combinations are getting mixed up. Novel combinations of alleles are being passed on from one generation to the next, making populations genetically diverse. And this turns out to be something that has some pretty important consequences, particularly in the context of evolution. And so, despite this sort of caveat surrounding these two really fundamental differences between sexual and asexual reproduction, they both seem to persist. And natural selection has favored them in different kinds of situations. And as it turns out, these two different kinds of reproductive strategies each have their different costs and benefits. And we can look at this simple table here that sort of compares some of the major differences that we see between these two strategies. For example, asexual reproduction often is very rapid and very efficient. And we know that mothers who are reproducing this way have a higher chance of gaining fitness compared to mothers who are reproducing sexually. In contrast, sexual reproduction is costly. It takes a lot of energy for mothers to provision eggs that have been fertilized by sperm. Sexual reproduction is kind of complicated. Individuals have to find mates and they have to secure these mates. And that comes with all kinds of different ramifications. And sexual reproduction is sometimes kind of dangerous for different reasons. There could be the possibility of sexually transmitted diseases being passed from one mate to another. There could be the possibility that an individual trying to find a mate makes themselves susceptible to predation. And so we can start asking questions about, well, in this context, which strategy might be more positive, which strategy might be more negative? Well, in this comparison, it kind of seems like asexual reproduction might be more positive. But in contrast, asexual reproduction, as we know, minimizes genetic variability, whereas sexual reproduction maximizes it. And when populations tend to have higher amounts of genetic variability, they tend to be able to deal with environmental change more easily. They tend to be able to deal with parasites better than populations that have low genetic variability. So in this comparison, we might say that sexual reproduction is more positive. Again, the effect on parasites. Asexual reproducing populations tend to have little to no parasite resistance, whereas sexually reproducing populations tend to have higher parasite resistance. And so in this case, we might say that sexual reproduction is more positive. And then there's this thing called a genetic load, which is basically just the accumulation of harmful mutations within a population. And asexual reproduction, because all of the offsprings are clones of the parents, this really does not limit the accumulation of harmful mutations. Many mutations can start to accumulate within asexually reproducing populations. Whereas in sexually reproducing populations, who tend to have novel combinations of alleles mixing up each time there's a reproductive event, this tends to minimize the accumulation of harmful mutations. And another interesting caveat we can look at particularly from the standpoint of fitness, is that asexual reproduction usually leads to the production of lots and lots and lots of offspring, whereas sexual reproduction tends to lead to the production of many, many fewer offspring. And we might even think about these differences in the context of sort of nature versus nurture. But a lot of the times, uh, the many, many offspring that are produced asexually don't get a whole lot of provisioning. And so, one of the strategies of producing a lot of offspring is that, well, maybe not all of them will survive necessarily, but so many of them are made, it doesn't really matter. Whereas in the context of sexually reproducing organisms who are not making a lot of offspring, they tend to invest a lot more care in provisioning those offspring to guarantee their survival and success. We can also sort of look at this in the context of how natural selection is operating on these different reproductive strategies from an ecological perspective. And if we look at it this way, we start to see that the differences in which strategy is being favored really depends upon different factors. And these factors are things like the predictability of the environment, the number of niches in the environment, which is kind of a fancy way of saying how many different ecological roles or how many different ecological functions or how many different possible habitats are there for different populations within a particular environment. And again, this thing we're going to call the parasite load. That is, what is the probability that this population is going to be infected by some type of a pathogenic, a parasitic agent. And as we see, when the environment is not very predictable, so when the environment is very, very predictable, to be clear, when the environment is very, very predictable, when the number of niches is relatively low, that is, there's not a lot of different things that these individuals in these populations can do, not a lot of different habitats available, and when the frequency of parasites is also pretty low, then asexual reproduction can be favored under natural selection. But the entirely opposite situation is true for sexually reproducing populations. When the environment is really unpredictable, that is to say, the environment's probably going to be changing all the time, when there are tons of different niches, tons of different roles individuals or populations can fulfill, or lots of different kinds of habitats available, and when the frequency of parasites is relatively high, then sexual reproduction is favored, and that's really because of the amount of genetic diversity that sexually reproducing populations have. High amounts of genetic diversity do serve populations well when the environment's unpredictable, when there are a lot of niches that can be filled, when there are a lot of potential possibilities to become infected. When the opposite situation is true, sexual reproduction is not favored nearly as much as more efficient asexual reproduction. And so this difference between these two strategies being favored really, it depends upon the amount of genetic diversity that it's affording populations to deal with these things, and also their reproductive rates. Probably, if we have low amounts of these variables, a lot of reproduction can happen asexually. But if there are high amounts of these variables, less reproduction is probably going to happen, and it's probably going to happen sexually. And this thing called the Red Queen hypothesis is really important in the context of how a population can deal with the amount of parasites that it has to that it encounters, and whether or not they're going to be favored reproducing asexually, or if they're going to be favored reproducing sexually. Now, something known as Muller's ratchet hypothesis basically explains one of the reasons why it is that asexually reproducing populations tend to suffer from the effects of harmful mutations. And the idea is analogous to this tool called a ratchet. If you've ever used one, a ratchet only turns in one direction. So if you're trying to tighten a bolt, the ratchet will only go forward, but it will afford you some space to back off and retighten down your bolt. But The idea is that a bolt is only turning in one direction, and this is thought of as being analogous to the accumulation of mutations in asexually reproducing populations. Once these mutations start to arise in asexually reproducing populations, they have basically no way to be removed because there's no sex mixing things up. And this is illustrated in this kind of complicated graphic here on the right. But basically what we see here on this x-axis is the number of mutations that an asexually reproducing population has at particular points in time. And on the y-axis, the frequency of individuals carrying that number of mutations, which is referred to as K in this situation. And so the story goes that despite the emergence of a new mutation here at this point in time, asexually reproducing populations still will increase in size. So it goes from having no mutations to having one mutation, to having even more individuals who have two mutations. And over time, too many of these harmful mutations begin to accumulate. And natural selection will start driving this population towards extinction. And we start to see that the frequency of individuals that carry 3 mutations, 4 mutations, 5 mutations, 6, 7, 8 mutations, for example, is going down and down and down because selection is not favoring individuals carrying these mutations, which most of the time, as we know, are probably going to be harmful. And so asexually reproducing populations really don't have any way out of this quandary. And that is part of the reason why we see them as having to deal with this thing called a genetic load. Another situation comes back to this idea of the red queen hypothesis. And this hypothesis postulates that asexual clones really cannot easily evolve to overcome parasites. And so, again, they have to deal with this thing called a parasite load. And in this cartoon here, we see a situation where a population has both sexually reproducing and asexually reproducing individuals in the same population. And over time, an asexual clone arises that turns out to be resistant to local pathogens. And thus, this asexual clone is reproducing very rapidly in frequency compared to the individuals in the population that reproduce sexually. But as this asexual clone starts to become more and more common, the parasites that are infecting it are also undergoing natural selection via a special process called coevolution. And the individual parasites who have different mutations of their own that enable them to become really, really good at infecting asexually reproducing hosts increase in frequency. And this causes the frequency of these asexually reproducing individuals in the population to go down because they don't have any way of dealing, they have less of a chance of dealing with adapting to these parasites compared to the individuals that are reproducing sexually, whom are getting novel combinations of alleles via fertilization. And so this is this idea that's made analogous to The Red Queen in Through the Looking Glass, which is this book by Lewis Carroll you probably have heard of. But the idea is that the queen's dragging Alice around, I think, and basically saying, you're constantly running just to stay in the same place. And that's very much what asexually reproducing populations are kind of stuck doing, constantly trying to evolve, but never really getting anywhere. And so the take home message is that sexually reproducing individuals are really, really a lot more likely to overcome co evolving parasites when compared to asexually reproducing individuals. And so this again points toward why sexual reproduction might be more favorable in a situation when the parasite load is higher. And so these ideas really get us at a better understanding of why it is, first of all, that either of these two strategies might persist, the context within which they might be favored, and then specifically why it is that sexual reproduction, despite its sort of lack of efficiency and lack of fitness interest in the females, has still become so prevalent amongst many, many populations, particularly of multicellular organisms. And when we talk about sexual reproduction, we kind of have to get at this idea that was actually originally proposed by Charles Darwin in this book he published back in the 19th century called "The Descent of Man in Selection in Relation to Sex." And basically, in this document, the concept of something called sexual selection was sort of first presented. And as you might recall, sexual selection causes evolution to occur, and it's very much similar to natural selection, but it's a special type of selection operating on traits very much specifically related to reproduction. And so these traits related to reproduction are either going to be traits that are specifically geared towards individuals obtaining mates and individuals gaining reproductive success. And these kinds of traits are generally very much contrasted by things like male-male competition that we see in the Galapagos marine iguanas, or things like female mate choice, as we see famously in the bird of paradise. And so these are the two kinds of processes that are really driving this special type of natural selection that we call sexual selection. And these two types of processes kind of have some more specific names. We can talk about intersexual selection, and this is selection that's influencing traits specifically that are related to mate choice. And it usually is a type of selection that's influencing morphological traits in males that are very frequently related to some pretty elaborate courtship displays. For example, the bird of paradise, again, has some pretty bizarre courtship displays. And you might be thinking, is this a face here? This black and light blue thing here? No, this is a feather cape. And this feather cape is accompanied by a very, very fancy dance show that this is a male bird of paradise, is using to try to attract the attention of this potential female mate here. Uh, Likewise, we can see some birds of paradise with these really, really elaborate ornamental plumes and colored faces. So this here is a male showing off his stuff, and this is a potential female mate who in this picture looks like she might be kind of interested in this really fancy looking guy. And so sexual selection has driven the evolution of these really, really exotic and elaborate traits simply because they're so tightly linked to the reproductive success of specifically the males who carry such traits. You might notice in these pictures that the females are not nearly as showy or elaborate as the males. And intersexual selection has been a very, very strong force in causing very elaborate traits uh, to contribute to higher fitness in males compared to females, because as it turns out, the females are the ones who, more often than not, are getting to choose the males as mates. And we might ask questions about, well, why might that be? Well, it's not too surprising to think that if the females are the ones who are producing far fewer eggs than the males are producing sperm, and the females are the ones who, more often than not, are going to be investing a lot of energy into partitioning the offspring that are fertilized, their eggs, by their eggs. The offspring that the eggs that are fertilized that give rise to their offspring, they're the ones who have a little bit more of a vested interest in actually going on to invest the energy to produce those offspring. So this is one idea that might explain why females are the ones kind of doing the choosing and the males are the ones kind of doing the advertising. This also leads to something called intrasexual selection, which is something influencing traits related to mate competition. And this is almost always happening via something called male-male conflict. And this happens in a multitude of different ways. We can think of features such as antlers in these deer being traits that are selected because they give these different deer, these male deer, the chance to battle for competition to get mates, or as signals to show other males that, hey, I'm a tougher male and I'm going to be the one who has a chance to get the mate and you are not. We can see things like battles between these stag beetles over their breeding and feeding territories. And so these stag beetles are trying to successfully produce with females, and they have a limited little area where they can do that, and so they're fighting over which male secures that area. Or things like the northern mockingbird, which is just one example of a bird species that can be pretty aggressive at defending its reproductive territory, its breeding territory. And so it might use different songs, not only to attract mates, but to deter other males from coming into its breeding territory. And so this, again, is an example of intrasexual selection, which is very much leading to this, is very much a product of this male-male conflict. Uh, Males competing for access to mates, access to successful breeding territory, access to perhaps resources needed in order to successfully reproduce. Now, sometimes selection for behavioral traits can promote this weird thing called sexual advertisement. And we see examples of this in multiple species of bowerbirds. And these bowerbirds basically will go around their environment and collect all kinds of attractive materials and sort of accumulate those materials around this thing called a bower, which is basically it's not exactly a nest for raising offspring, but it is a nest-like structure where the bowerbird will arrange all of these attractive materials, hoping that a female will come along. And that female, if she does come along, will assess the bowerbird based on the accumulation of these resources and how attractive they are. And this is sort of a signal to the female of what a good mate this particular male bowerbird might be. We can see a similar example here where there's the bower, this nest-like sort of uh, structure, and this bowerbird has collected all of this trash actually from the environment, and it's accumulated this material around its bower in hopes of a female coming along and being interested in mating with him. And so this would be another example of a form of intersexual selection, selection on different traits between males and females that are particularly related to female mate choice. An example instead of intersexual selection on traits among males is seen in this thing we call mating leks. And in these mating leks, multiple males will converge in a single space to compete for potential females. We can see this in these birds called cock of the rock, and we can even more famously see this in sage grouse. And these different sage grouse males have these different interesting features, these morphological features that have been selected via intersexual selection for their different abilities to attract females. And they do this in these things called leks. And these leks are sort of like arenas, and these leks are typically dominated by one or two alpha males, and then lesser so dominated by some beta males. And then there are a whole bunch of other males that sort of hang out on the periphery of the lek that have a much lower chance of being able to attract a female mate. And as it turns out, within the lek, usually the most beautifully plumed male from the perspective of the female who has the most appealing display will be the one who secures the most mates. And usually, as indicated by sort of the size of these little circles, dominant alpha males occupy a lot more territory within these lek spaces compared to the less dominant males. And so this is an interesting form of sexual advertisement that has led to selection favoring some pretty elaborate traits in males, within which there's some variation, and the females get to choose which of the individuals who carry such traits is the one that she will mate with. So an important question that arises from looking at these sexually advertised traits in males is that, are they necessarily indicative of the mate's fitness? And this leads to something that we call the good genes hypothesis. And the good genes hypothesis basically postulates that morphological traits within males that are sexually selected are correlated with this thing we call lifetime fitness. That is to say that they are correlated with genetic quality that this male has, not just at the gene locus responsible for the sexually selected trait, but at all kinds of other genetic loci. and that this genetic quality points towards the male's ability to produce more offspring, which is in the female's benefit. This increases her chances of passing her genes on to the next generation. And one example we can look at comes from these three-spined sticklebacks. And these fish uh, tend to be more attractive to females when they are redder in color. And as it turns out, there is a correlation between their redness and their ability to resist infection by tapeworms. And so we can look at this graph that shows the redness of a potential father, shown on some scale here on the x-axis, going from not very red to being very red. And we can look at the offspring's the rate of infection by these tapeworm parasites, going from 0 to 100% on the y-axis. And this data was collected in a couple different aquatic environments where these fish occur. But basically, the point is, as these potential fathers or these fathers are redder and redder and redder, they seem to have higher resistance to infection by these parasites. And so this supports the good genes hypothesis that the trait that's attracting females to this male, which is his redness, is also correlated with his ability to resist infection. And so this is a signal to the female, what we would call an honest signal to the female that not only is this father attractive because of its redness, but that redness is correlated with other aspects of fitness. But a question that often comes up uh, when talking about the good genes hypothesis is if, in fact, males with physically attractive traits for females always do make an honest signal of good genes. And that question is not exactly easily answered. It seems like most of the time, yes, but sometimes there might be cheaters as well. Now, another byproduct of male-male competition is that rival males might start to interfere with each other's reproductive success via this thing we call sperm competition. And we can see this happening in a couple different ways. One way is seen if we look at male chickens who are attempting to mate with a single female, which we call a hen. And if there's just one male chicken, which we call a rooster, trying to mate with a particular hen, this particular individual is going to make a certain investment in producing sperm. Um, if there are instead two males or two roosters competing to mate with a single hen, both of them are going to have to put a greater investment into the production of sperm. And this costs energy. And if there are even more roosters trying to mate with that same single hen, each of them are going to have to invest even more into producing sperm. And so this is getting back to this idea of the trade-off between investing in reproduction versus investing in survival. And there is an interaction between those two things. And it seems to be the case that when more males are competing for one, maybe just one female or a small number of females, that they are investing more in reproduction and probably not investing as much into survival. Something else similar to this is what we see in damselflies. And these damselflies, um, we can see an example of them here. This is a male damselfly. This is a female damselfly, and they are indeed involved in copulation in this particular instance. But as it turns out, prior to copulation, a male damselfly will remove any sperm that that female might be carrying from other males uh, prior to him actually delivering his own sperm in an attempt to fertilize her eggs. And they do this with a very unique feature that has evolved, which is a scoop attached to the tip of their penis. And this scoop goes in and scrapes out any sperm that might be in there from other males within the female and removes that sperm so that he's now the only one who's going to put sperm into the female. And so this is another example of sperm competition amongst males. And we're seeing this happening in two very, very distant related taxonomic lineages, birds and these insects, um, who both are reproducing sexually and both are experiencing some level of sperm competition, which is directly related to the male's ability to obtain a mate. So it also turns out that selection can make sexual reproduction a deadly thing. And this can happen in a few ways. A couple examples are shown here on this slide. We have something called infanticide, and this is kind of cruel and tragic, but we see this in lions, where rival male lions might actually kill the cubs of other males in order to increase their own fitness. So if one male lion produced five offspring and another male lion produced five offspring, their fitnesses would be equal. So if this male lion who produced five offspring goes and starts killing the offspring of this other male lion, such that the number of his offspring go down, his fitness has gone up. And this does happen in nature. Another kind of different example comes in the form of this thing we call sexual cannibalism. And this is seen in the praying mantis, which is another insect example. And here we have the males, and here we have a male, and here we have a female. And this male is going to successfully copulate with this female and fertilize her eggs. But after fertilization has happened, the female eats her male mate. She kills him and eats him. And you might think, well, that's kind of crazy. Like, why would this even happen? Well, it doesn't really matter to the female because once her eggs are fertilized, she has a chance of increasing her own fitness, and she probably doesn't really care a whole lot about the male's fitness. But again, looking at the interaction between resource allocation to survival and resource allocation to reproduction, this female is gaining energy and nutrients by virtue of eating her mate. And this increased energy that it's getting is helping it develop its eggs more efficiently and probably helping it survive more efficiently. And so, although this might seem like a really bizarre reproductive system, it does happen. Now, reproductive success of populations can also depend upon the abundance of males. And in fact, that is something we see in populations of the southern elephant seal. And these elephant seal males are very, very competitive with one another. And as it turns out, in a population of elephant seals, we might have a certain number of males and a certain number of females. And if we were even just to assume that the proportion of males to females was 50-50, as it turns out, there might really only be a couple males really involved in the mating. And these are alpha males that are called beach masters. And this image here shows where a beach master is situated within the whole southern elephant seal population. And maybe there are some other males that we might call beta males or peripheral males who have a much lower chance of being involved in reproduction. But the reproductive success of this population kind of depends upon how many males are going to be involved in mating. And when there are more males, there tend to be fewer offspring when compared to when there are fewer numbers of males involved in mating. So this graph here kind of shows the number of offspring that a particular male might father and the number of males that are in the population at this particular point in time. And what we kind of see is that when there are a lot of males, well, most males aren't really making a whole lot of pups. And maybe fewer numbers of males are making a very small number of pups. And that maybe an even smaller number of males is really responsible for most of the pups that are being sired in this population. So maybe only 2, 3, or 4 males are involved in producing as many as 25, 30, or 35 different offspring. And this is a realistic situation that has been observed. And one of the consequences of this situation is that it does lower the effective population size of this group of seals. And by virtue of having their effective population size reduced, because very few males are involved in mating, genetic diversity in the population is potentially going down. And that can have consequences for the evolutionary future of this population. But whatever the case may be, this does happen. And as it turns out, uh, more often than not, a small number of males in this situation are the ones who are passing on their genes to the next generation. This can also go in another direction where if males are able to have a lot of different female mates, they have a chance of producing more offspring. They have a higher chance of passing on more genes to the next generation. And we call this situation polygamy. And so we might have a situation where males have some harems, and they might have a harem size of one, which is basically just a monogamous relationship, or they might have a harem size of two, three, or four. And then we can look at, well, how many offspring or fledglings are these particular males capable of having? This example comes from the reed warbler. And as it turns out, the more females that males are mating with, the more offspring that they're able to have in this example. And so this is allowing a particular male to pass on more genes. If a particular male is doing this disproportionately within the population compared to other males, it could decrease genetic variation in the population yet again, because one or two males mating with more females and maybe other males not mating at all. It's just these few males who are passing genes on to the next generation. And so this has an influence on the offspring of these particular females, because most of the genetic information coming from the fathers is really only coming from a few different fathers. But females still might benefit from this because they're getting a higher chance of passing on their genes as well. So kind of in some ways, at the individual level, the males are benefiting because they're mating with a lot of females, making a lot of offspring, and all these different females are able to produce a whole bunch of offspring too. So while this benefits individuals' fitness, it might not necessarily be the greatest thing for the population's fitness over longer periods of time, if it in fact does lead to decreases in genetic diversity. And in fact, as it turns out, we can actually really look at a whole diversity of different mating systems that occur amongst different organisms. For example, again, a bird example, the duncock we can look at, or sorry, the dunnock. But different mating systems really can affect the size and quality of breeding territory that different individuals and populations have. And so the simplest example might be something like monogamy, where a single female and a single male overlap in their breeding territory, and that's just kind of it. They're only going to reproduce with one another. In contrast, we could look at something called polygyny, where a particular male might be breeding with multiple females, such as we see in this example here, where we have polygamy, also known as polygyny. And so we might have a single female, and these two females have separate breeding ranges, but a single male overlaps across both of those breeding ranges and is mating with both females. We can have the opposite situation, which we would call polyandry, where the breeding range of a single female overlaps with that of two separate females. And so two different males are breeding with a single female. And maybe she's benefiting in this situation because she's getting higher chances of passing on her genes with multiple males. And we can have even a more complicated situation called polygynyandry, where there are multiple females and multiple males whose breeding ranges overlap. And basically, different males are mating with different females, and likewise, different females are mating with different males. And in some ways, we might think of this as being advantageous because this is really increasing the frequency at which different genes are getting mixed up within the population from one generation to the next. So there are different possibilities for these mating systems, and they do influence the reproductive success of different individuals, and they can have different kinds of evolutionary outcomes. And there are a multitude of ways that this can play out. There might be something to be said for individuals being monogamous because maybe they have a higher chance at successfully rearing their offspring via collective effort. In contrast, again, having multiple males and females breeding with one another might contribute to increased genetic diversity in the population, more so than having a higher frequency of monogamous individuals. So things are complicated. It really depends upon the environmental circumstances, but there certainly is diversity in these mating systems. And something that basically is a product of sexual selection that is very apparent is something called sexual dimorphism. And we know that strong selection for these so-called secondary sexual traits really can drive these distinct morphological differences between males and females, to the point where it's very easy to tell males and females apart within populations often. In birds, this happens all the time. We can see an example here where we have a fancy male and a rather drab female. In mammals, such as primates, we can see difference between the two genders. In insects such as butterflies, we can see differences between males and females, and even in fish, there is some level of sexual dimorphism, although maybe it's not as strong as it might be in, say, birds. But the differences in the physical traits of males and the physical traits of females that are observable in many, many species are thought to be a direct product of sexual selection. And selection for these different dimorphic traits can get really extreme. And we can have a situation where it causes something we call runaway sexual selection. And this occurs when the selective forces favoring a trait which is related to mate choice, intrasexual selection, is so strong that it overcomes the fitness that is compromised by carrying the trait. And one of the best examples we see of this comes in these birds called widow birds, long-tailed widow birds. And true to the name, these widow birds, the males of these widow birds tend to have really long tails, which in some cases are longer than their actual body sizes. And as it turns out, male widow birds with the longest tails seem to have the highest reproductive success. And this was sort of cleverly analyzed in an experiment that somebody conducted, which might have been slightly on the cruel side, but basically, scientists went out into a population of these widow birds and sampled normal birds, normal males. Then they took some of these males and they shortened their tails, and they took some of these birds and glued on extra pieces of tail. And then they released these birds out into nature and looked at the reproductive success of these different categories of tail lengths in these widow birds. So the mean number of nests per male is basically a measure of reproductive success. As it turns out, birds that had their tails shortened had decreased reproductive success, whereas birds who had extra segments added to their tails had higher reproductive success. And so this pointed towards the fact that sexual selection was favoring extreme tail length in these birds, which females very, very much preferred. The birds with the longest tails were able to attract the most females and end up having the highest number of nests. But it's considered a runaway process because um, this trait of having a really, really long tail really interferes with fitness. It confers a fitness disadvantage. These birds with long tails don't fly very well at all. They're very unwieldy. And so this makes them very susceptible to predation and might actually influence their survival. Again, this comes back to the interaction between reproductive success and survival. And in this case, it kind of seems like, despite the fact that there is a fitness cost to male birds with really long tails because they could be killed, as long as they're able to find a mate, attract a female with that long tail, and reproduce, whatever happens after the fact kind of doesn't matter so much because they were able to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so this is an example of what's driving this process of runaway sexual selection for rather extreme traits that really confer fitness disadvantages. We can also see this in male peacocks with really elaborate plumage displays that are selected to attract female mates, but otherwise don't really do a whole lot to ensure their survival. Uh, Another important trait that we see emerge in birds that's probably under some level of sexual selection is song. And mate attraction related to bird song is probably under pretty strong sexual selection. One of the most diverse, if not the most diverse group of birds today are passerines. These are the so-called songbirds. For example, things like the wood thrush, but there are many, many other examples of songbirds. And most of these birds are using song as a means of attracting mates. They might use these songs for some other reasons as well, but one of the most important reasons why these songbirds have these vocalizations is in order to attract female mates. And so, as it turns out, the males are the ones who do most of the singing. We can quantify these bird songs in something called a spectrogram, which kind of provides a nice visualization of what a particular song looks like. And this is not too different than music notation, where we have time on the x-axis and the frequency of the pitches that these birds are vocalizing, shown on this sort of y-axis, sort of bass and treble clefs. And as it turns out, different bird species and even different individuals within populations sort of have signature songs that could be seen in these spectrograms. And there's some variation in these songs that occur sort of from one generation to the next. And a lot of that has to do with the learning abilities of the chicks that are learning how to sing these songs. And if you don't know this, most birds are learning their songs, most male birds are learning their songs from their fathers. Sometimes they don't learn the songs perfectly. And that could influence their ability to successfully attract a female mate. If a sunbird does not learn the father's song perfectly enough, it might not be able to attract a mate successfully in the future. And there are other things, there are other aspects of these songs that make them attractive to females, such as the rhythmic speed of the song. Maybe a faster song attracts a female more effectively than a slower song. The width of the frequency range could be important. Females might recognize a broader range of frequencies as a signal of a potential male mate with better genes, or the diversity of the song repertoire, such as in things like mockingbirds, who sing a whole diverse repertoire of different songs. Females might recognize a higher diversity of bird songs being indicative of higher lifetime reproductive success or higher genetic quality in their potential male mate. So this is yet another feature we see in some organisms, not just birds, also in things like frogs, perhaps maybe also in things like crickets, which also potentially are using songs to attract mates as well. And then lastly, we can sort of ask this question, well, so many of the examples of sexually selected traits that we see amongst taxa come from animals. Well, what about sexual selection in plants? Does it operate? And it's a lot more challenging to try to understand sexual selection in plants, but it does happen. Biologists do think about this. And there are a handful of different characteristics, particularly in flowering plants, that do appear to have some relationship with sexual selection. This becomes complicated by the fact that, for the most part, a lot of these flowering plants are undergoing reproduction via external vectors, that is, by pollination. And this is usually happening by some type of a pollinating animal, usually insects, sometimes birds, and even in even fewer cases, sometimes even bats. But certain morphological characteristics in plants do seem to be associated with different frequencies of reproductive success, such as things like floral symmetry. So plants with radial symmetry might be selected for that morphology because it increases their chances of attracting pollinators. Likewise, maybe instead bilateral symmetry in flowers is better at attracting pollinators, or even asymmetrical floral forms. And also things like the position of flowers. So flowers are arranged on stems in a multitude of different ways. They could be very simple in arrangement. They could become more complex. And the differences in these arrangements might really have different successes in attracting pollinators, which is kind of leading to higher chances of certain flowers being pollinated compared to others. And also things like nectar productivity. Some flowers might produce more nectars than others, and if they do, that might increase their chances of attracting pollinators. And so these different features of these flowering plants appear to be under a sort of unusual form of sexual selection. And sometimes floral displays really can be thought of as being male functioning. And there can be variation in the elaborateness of these different flowers amongst these different individuals in a population. And those different forms are thought of as being male functioning. And this kind of leads to this thing called male-male competition, intersexual selection. Certain floral forms might have a higher chance of attracting pollinators compared to others. And this leads to something we call cryptic dioecy. And cryptic dioecy is basically allowing flowers, even though they're bisexual or hermaphroditic, to function as really more male than female. And competition for pollinators is kind of analogous to competition for mates, again. But as opposed to this happening within a single population or even within a single species, it can happen within a single species or among a whole bunch of different plant species that co-occur, that are competing for the same pollinators in order to help them pass pollen from one individual to the ovules or the pistils, the female organs of another individual, in order for them to reproduce. So there is competition for mates. It's just being mediated by external pollinating vectors. And then even pollen grains themselves can compete for access to plant ovaries, which we call ovule choice. And this is very much analogous to choosy females, kind of like intrasexual selection. And so the ovules of certain plants are actually choosing which pollen grains, which contain the male gametes, the sperm, are going to get down into the ovules and fertilize the eggs. And if a certain number of pollen grains land on the tip of a pistil of a flower, they will start growing these things called pollen tubes that extend down to the ovules, which is where the eggs are. But not all of those pollen tubes are going to have an equal chance of being successful at delivering their sperm down to those eggs. The ovule actually, probably at some chemical level, will sense which particular pollen grain, pollen tube, it wants to have fertilize its eggs. And so this is very much, again, analogous to this ovule being a choosy female deciding which pollen grain, which sperm she's going to use to fertilize her egg. So it's a lot more unusual to think about sexual selection in plants because plant reproduction is a little bit different than animal reproduction, but it certainly does appear to be something that happens. All right, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you next time.